It's August 17th, day 171 of this war, and the 60-day peace deadline the United States and Iran agreed to just expired with absolutely nothing signed, which means the gloves are officially off again. Welcome back to the video. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Because today we're diving deep into exactly what just got unleashed and why Tehran is genuinely running out of road. Here's what we're covering today. A president who just threatened to bomb an entire country for getting in the way of a shipping deal, a second aircraft carrier quietly slipping through the Strait of Malacca on a collision course with the Gulf, a blockade that the Pentagon now says it can run forever, a shipping lane that has basically flatlined to almost nothing, a homemade cryptocurrency toll scheme nobody's paying, and a regional proxy network that's cracking apart on 3 separate fronts at the exact same time. This is the moment Iran's worst nightmare stopped being a threat on paper and started becoming reality on the water. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why, piece by piece, front by front. Let's start with the deadline itself, because this is the trigger for everything else happening right now. Back in June, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, a 60-day window meant to end the war for good and lock in an agreement over Iran's nuclear program. 60 days to get it done. Stoops. 60 days to walk both sides back from the brink. That clock ran out today, and there is no deal, not even close to one. The ceasefire that was supposed to hold through this window was already declared dead by the president himself back in mid-July, and since then it's been strikes, counterstrikes, tanker attacks, and a blockade that never actually stopped squeezing, no matter what the paperwork said on the surface. So when reporters pressed the president today about where things actually stand, he brushed off the deadline entirely, said it was irrelevant, said there's no timeline to end this, said he's not in a hurry, and specifically said the midterms have nothing to do with his thinking, which honestly tells you a lot about the pressure he's under, just by the fact that he felt the need to say it unprompted. That's not the posture of someone who's desperate to wrap this up quickly. That's the posture of someone who thinks time is on his side, and given what's happening to Iran's economy right now, he might genuinely be right about that calculation. But the real headline out of today isn't the deadline expiring quietly. It's what the president said about Oman. For weeks now, Oman has been playing mediator between Washington and Tehran, working specifically on a plan for how ships would actually transit the Strait of Hormuz going forward. And according to Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson, an understanding has actually been reached. Iran is saying, publicly, that they and Oman have agreed on a map for the transit route. Ships entering near Iranian waters and exiting near Oman. No fees or tolls during what they're calling an interim period. That's a real diplomatic development. That's the kind of thing that should be quietly celebrated as a step toward de-escalation, something both sides could point to as proof that quiet channels are still capable of producing results, even when the loud public channels are screaming at each other. Instead, when the president got asked about it on a call with a Fox News correspondent, his response was to threaten to bomb Oman if the country gets in the way. Direct quote, more or less, promising to unleash serious consequences on a longtime American partner in the region, simply for negotiating a shipping arrangement with Iran. Think about that for a second. Oman isn't the enemy here. Oman is a country that borders Yemen, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, sits directly on the Strait of Hormuz, and has spent months trying to build a framework that keeps oil moving and keeps sailors from getting killed in the crossfire. And the response from the White House is a threat of bombing. That tells you everything about how volatile this moment actually is, and how little patience is left for anyone, ally or adversary, who tries to chart a path that doesn't run entirely through Washington's terms. A senior Middle East diplomat with direct knowledge of the Oman-Iran talks pushed back on the framing almost immediately, saying Oman's entire objective in these discussions has simply been working toward a solution that leads to reopening the strait, not undermining anybody. But that clarification barely made a dent in the headlines, because a threat like that dominates the news cycle, no matter how quickly someone tries to walk the temperature back down. Now, later that same day, in the Oval Office, the president was pushed to clarify those comments, and he doubled down instead of walking anything back. Said he's not looking to extend that ceasefire agreement with Iran, said no when asked directly if he wanted more time. And when asked whether the two sides are actually making progress toward peace, he said Iran wants to make a deal, but not the kind of deal he considers necessary. That's the core of the entire standoff right there. Iran wants an end to the blockade, a withdrawal of American forces from around its borders, and reparations for the damage inflicted during this war. The president has rejected every single one of those demands outright, insisting instead that Tehran should be the one paying reparations, and reasserting that the United States, in his words, controls the strait. Two completely incompatible visions of how this ends, sitting on the table at the exact moment the clock ran out. He also described Iran's negotiators in a strange, almost respectful way, calling them good poker players while insisting in the same breath that they're dying, which is about as blunt a summary of the American red on Iran's position as you're going to get from the man himself. And honestly, when you look at the numbers we're about to walk through, it's hard to argue with the assessment. Let's talk about what's actually happening on the water right now, because this is where Iran's nightmare gets very, very real. Shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has essentially collapsed. Maritime trackers reported traffic falling nearly 20% in a single week, dropping from a high of 19 vessels on August 11th down to just 3 ships making the transit by the following weekend. 3 ships, through one of the most important waterways on the entire planet. One monitoring service put the total for an entire weekend at just 13 ships, only 3 of them moving on the final day counted. This is not a slowdown. This is a strait that has functionally stopped functioning as a global trade artery, and every single day it stays that way. Iran's economy bleeds out a little more, drop by drop, tanker by tanker that never shows up. And this collapse in traffic is layering directly on top of an already brutal financial hemorrhage. Back when the blockade was first fully enforced, the Pentagon estimated it was costing Iran roughly $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue within the first several weeks alone. Since then, officials have cited figures approaching $500 million a day during the peak enforcement periods. Multiply that out across the months this has now dragged on, and you're looking at a regime that has watched tens of billions of dollars in potential revenue simply evaporate, all while trying to fund a war, prop up proxies across the region, and keep its own population from turning on the government entirely. That's not a number you shrug off. That's the kind of number that starts eating into currency reserves, into fuel subsidies, into the ability to pay soldiers and bureaucrats on time, and into every single lever a government has for keeping a country functioning under wartime pressure. So how is Iran responding to a financial situation like that? Not by backing down, by trying to build an entirely new toll system out of thin air. Reports have confirmed that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has stood up something they're calling the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, essentially an attempt to charge ships for the privilege of transiting Hormuz, with fees running as high as $2 million per vessel, payable in Chinese yuan, Bitcoin, or the stablecoin USDT. Think about how desperate that is for a second. A country that used to control one of the most valuable shipping lanes on Earth through sheer geography is now reduced to trying to run what amounts to a digital extortion racket, demanding cryptocurrency payments from tanker operators just to keep some trickle of revenue flowing in. And it's not working, because Western Allied commercial shipping has recorded essentially 0 transits through the strait since early May, according to major maritime intelligence trackers. Nobody's paying the toll. Nobody's playing along. The strait Iran claims to control has become a strait nobody wants to touch. And a toll booth that nobody drives through doesn't generate revenue. It just generates headlines about how far a regime has fallen from actually controlling the waterway it insists still belongs to it. Now let's talk about the military side of this pressure campaign, because this is where the actual worst nightmare part comes into play. Just days before the deadline expired, the Secretary of Defense confirmed that the United States Navy can maintain its current naval posture around Iran indefinitely, simply by rotating ships in and out. That single sentence is a nightmare for Tehran, because it means there is no natural expiration date on any of this, no point where American resolve is expected to run dry, no light at the end of the tunnel where the fleet just goes home. It's structured now as a sustainable, rotating presence that can run for years if it has to, and that structural shift from a temporary deployment to a permanent posture is exactly the kind of thing that changes how a regime plans its entire wartime strategy. And the proof of that commitment showed up almost immediately. The USS Abraham Lincoln, which departed San Diego all the way back in November of last year, has now spent more than 260 consecutive days at sea. That's an extraordinary length of deployment for any carrier strike group, let alone one that's been engaged in active combat operations for months on end. It was supposed to come home back in May. Instead, it stayed in theater once the war against Iran kicked off in February, and it has been grinding through combat sorties, launching aircraft, and absorbing the wear and tear of sustained operations ever since. Crews are exhausted, systems are being pushed to their limits, and still, the mission continues without a single day of pause, because that's what it takes to keep this level of pressure on Iran running around the clock. So rather than simply pulling Lincoln out and leaving a gap, the Navy confirmed the USS George Washington is now moving through the Strait of Malacca, heading west, without officially disclosing its final destination for operational security reasons. But everybody watching this knows exactly where it's going. It's the handoff. One carrier strike group swapping out for another, keeping 2 carriers effectively in the fight at once during the transition, and sending the clearest possible signal to Tehran that American naval presence in this theater isn't winding down. It's being institutionalized. Lincoln's crew finally gets to go home to their families after 9 brutal months at sea, and George Washington steps in to keep the pressure exactly where it's been. That's not de-escalation. That's a machine built for the long haul, engineered specifically so that the human cost of sustained deployment never becomes the reason the mission stops. Let's zoom out and look at the full scale of what's actually been assembled in this region, because it puts everything else in context. At various points throughout this campaign, the United States has had 2 full carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in the area, backed by destroyers spread across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, additional combat vessels stationed directly in the Persian Gulf, and access to roughly 8 regional air bases capable of supporting sustained high-tempo operations. Analysts tracking this buildup have described it as enabling something in the range of 800 sorties per day if needed. 800. That's not a deterrence posture, that's a machine built and postured for a sustained air campaign that can scale up or down depending on what happens next. And it's been sitting there, ready, for months, without ever fully standing down. And this is on top of everything that came before it. Back at the very start of this war, when the initial strikes hit Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the operation involved thousands of personnel and well over 100 aircraft. Precision strikes using massive bunker-buster bombs delivered by stealth bombers flying all the way from bases in Missouri, plus dozens of cruise missiles launched from submarines, hitting facilities at some of Iran's most heavily fortified nuclear sites. Those bunker busters alone represent one of the most complex single-strike packages the U.S. military has ever assembled, requiring a grueling multi-hour round-trip flight profile with extensive aerial refueling just to reach targets buried deep enough underground that almost no other munition on Earth could have touched them. Iran's response to that opening salvo was to fire missiles at American installations in the region, and the retaliatory cycle that followed has barely slowed down since. Every time Iran pushes on shipping in the Strait, every time Tehran tries to reassert control through drone strikes or intimidation, the response from Washington escalates right back, because the entire strategic posture in this theater has been built from the ground up to never let Iran feel like the pressure is loosening. It's also worth understanding just how unusual this level of sustained buildup actually is, historically, because context really does matter here. There was a period earlier this year, before the war even began, where American officials noted there wasn't a single carrier operating anywhere in the Central Command area of responsibility, the first gap of its kind in years. That absence didn't last. Within weeks, tanker aircraft started surging into regional bases, with reports at the time noting a sudden jump in the number of aerial refueling assets stationed at bases like Al Udeid in Qatar. Carrier strike groups started repositioning, and by the time the first strikes actually landed, the United States had assembled what analysts described as its largest naval presence in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. That's the scale we're talking about. Not a limited punitive strike package, but a full theater-wide mobilization designed to be sustained indefinitely. And every week that passes without a resolution just adds more weight to that word, indefinitely. There's also a fascinating piece of this that outside observers have picked up on, which is how deliberately the current posture is being structured for depth and continuity rather than just a single knockout blow. Analysts have specifically noted that this configuration carries more staying power than earlier operations against Iran, describing it as broader deterrence deployment that can expand or contract as needed rather than a one-time strike package that fires and then disappears. That distinction matters enormously, because a force built to expand or contract on demand is a force built to be there for as long as it takes, not a force built around a single dramatic night of bombing followed by a quiet withdrawal. Even foreign analysts watching from outside the conflict have acknowledged just how difficult it would be for Washington to walk away from a posture this entrenched, precisely because so much infrastructure, so many personnel, and so much political capital has already been sunk into keeping it running. Now here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for Iran strategically, because this isn't just about ships and bombers anymore, it's about the fact that Iran is now fighting a war on multiple fronts at once, with a military that has already taken catastrophic losses. Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen have started attacking Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea, opening up yet another shipping corridor to threats at the exact moment Hormuz traffic has already collapsed. That's not a coincidence, that's a calculated attempt to spread the pain, to make sure that if Iran can't get relief in the Gulf, the entire region feels the consequences through the Red Sea instead. In fact, just as this deadline was expiring, the Houthis claimed they'd struck what they described as a Saudi military vessel along with several other targets, another data point in a pattern that keeps repeating itself, striking wherever Iran's proxy network still has reach, precisely because the reach elsewhere keeps shrinking week after week. Except here's the problem with that strategy. Yemen's own military has been ramping up its counteroffensive against the Houthis at the exact same time, meaning Iran's most reliable regional proxy is now fighting a two-front war of its own, stretched between attacking international shipping and defending its own territory from a resurgent Yemeni government offensive. That's a proxy force that used to be treated as a reliable extension of Iranian strategy, and it's now bleeding resources trying to survive on its own home turf while still being asked to project chaos outward into the Red Sea. And it's worth remembering just how heavily the Houthis have relied on Iranian resupply to build that arsenal in the first place. Interdictions over the past year alone have uncovered hundreds of missile components and hundreds of tons of munitions bearing Iranian markings, arriving in coded kits specifically designed to be hard to trace. Every one of those shipments that gets seized on the way in is one less missile the Houthis have available for this exact two-front fight they're now stuck in. Meanwhile, over in Lebanon, Israeli forces have been carrying out deadly strikes against Hezbollah, another core piece of Iran's so-called axis of resistance, killing senior commanders and grinding down what's left of that organization's operational capacity. Just this week alone, Israeli forces killed a senior Hezbollah commander, one of a string of targeted strikes that have systematically dismantled that organization's leadership structure over recent months. So picture the map Iran's leadership is staring at right now, its own navy bottled up in port by an indefinite blockade. Its most valuable shipping lane sitting essentially empty because nobody trusts a toll booth funded by cryptocurrency demands. Its Proxy in Yemen fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Its Proxy in Lebanon getting hammered by Israeli strikes and losing senior leadership one funeral at a time. And now, sitting on top of all of that, a fresh American carrier steaming toward the region, specifically because the Pentagon wants to prove it can sustain this pressure indefinitely. That is not a position of strength. That's a regime being squeezed from every single direction at once, with essentially no room left to maneuver. And it's worth pausing here to really sit with what indefinitely actually means in this context, because that word is doing a lot of work. It means the Pentagon has built a rotation system, specifically so that no single carrier group has to bear this burden forever, which means there's no natural off-ramp coming from exhaustion on the American side. Contrast that with Iran, whose navy doesn't have a rotation system to fall back on because there's nowhere for those ships to go. They're simply trapped, sitting in port, unable to move without risking seizure or destruction the moment they try to break out. One side has a sustainable machine, the other side has a slowly tightening noose. That asymmetry is the entire ballgame right now, and it's the single biggest reason why time genuinely does appear to be working against Tehran, no matter how much confident rhetoric comes out of their foreign ministry. Let's also talk about what this economic pressure actually looks like on the ground inside Iran, because numbers on a spreadsheet only tell part of the story. When you cut off billions of dollars in oil revenue month after month, that money doesn't come from nowhere else to replace it. It comes out of currency stability, out of the ability to import basic goods, out of fuel subsidies that ordinary Iranians depend on, out of salaries for government workers and military personnel alike. A regime that's bleeding out at the rate this one has been bleeding for months cannot simply absorb that forever without consequences rippling through its own population. That's precisely why you're seeing increasingly desperate moves like the cryptocurrency toll scheme. Because when your normal channels of revenue get strangled, you start reaching for increasingly unconventional and increasingly unstable ways to keep the lights on. And when even those workarounds fail to attract a single willing customer, that tells you just how thoroughly isolated this regime has become in the eyes of the global shipping industry. And that desperation extends into the political sphere too. There's been a notable reshuffling happening inside Iran's own military command structure recently. New appointments across leadership positions announced by figures close to the regime's inner circle. And reshuffles like that typically signal one of two things: either serious internal dissatisfaction with how this war has been managed, or an attempt to bring in figures seen as more willing to escalate. Either read on that situation points to the same underlying reality: a regime under enormous internal strain, trying to figure out how to survive a conflict it clearly did not expect to still be fighting this many months later with this little to show for it. On top of that, American officials have continued attributing ongoing cyber activity targeting water systems back in the United States to a group affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, which tells you that even while its conventional military options keep narrowing, Tehran is still reaching for whatever asymmetric tools remain available, no matter how far from the battlefield they might operate. There's also the nuclear dimension sitting underneath all of this, because that's ultimately what this entire war was supposed to be about in the first place. The core American demand throughout this conflict has remained consistent: that Iran surrender its remaining stockpile of highly enriched uranium, roughly 400 kilograms of it, limit any future enrichment activity well below weapons-relevant purity levels, halt any weapons development work entirely, restrict its ballistic missile program, and cut off support for its regional proxies, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. That's an enormous list of demands for any government to swallow, and Iran has spent months insisting it will not simply capitulate to terms like that without something significant in return, namely an end to the blockade and compensation for war damage. So even if the shipping dispute over Hormuz somehow gets resolved through the Oman Channel, that underlying nuclear standoff remains completely unsettled, which means even a partial deal on the Strait wouldn't actually end this war. It would just shift the fight back toward the negotiating table on the nuclear question specifically, with all the military pressure still sitting there in the background as leverage. So where does all of this actually leave things as we move past this expired deadline into whatever comes next? On one side, you've got a president who just publicly threatened to bomb a mediating nation over a shipping dispute, doubling down rather than softening his position, backed by a military posture explicitly designed to sustain this level of pressure without any expiration date. On the other side, you've got a regime whose navy is trapped, whose flagship shipping lane has collapsed to a trickle of traffic, whose economy has been drained by tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue, whose homegrown toll scheme is being ignored by literally every ship that matters, and whose regional proxy network is simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts against forces that smell blood and are pressing every single advantage. That combination, the indefinite naval posture, the fresh carrier arriving to replace an exhausted one without ever reducing overall presence, the multi-front squeeze on Iran's proxies, the collapse of Hormuz shipping traffic, and the economic strangulation of the one route that could have provided any relief, that's what actually constitutes unleashing Iran's worst nightmare. It's not a single dramatic strike or a single headline-grabbing weapon system. It's the sustained, grinding, multi-domain pressure campaign that gives Tehran absolutely nowhere to turn, no ally willing to fully break ranks and help them out from under it, and no realistic timeline where the pain simply goes away on its own. What happens from here really depends on whether Iran's leadership decides the cost of continued defiance has finally exceeded whatever benefit they think they're getting from holding out. Every week that passes with traffic through Hormuz sitting in the single digits is another week of revenue that simply does not exist anymore. Every additional carrier that gets rotated into theater is proof that American resolve isn't wavering no matter how long this drags on. And every new front that opens up against Iran's proxies, whether in Yemen or in Lebanon, is one more crack in a regional strategy that Tehran spent decades building and is now watching crumble in real time under the weight of a war it triggered, but clearly did not anticipate lasting this long or costing this much. Even the informal talks the president mentioned, having with figures inside the Revolutionary Guard, suggest that back channels are still open somewhere beneath all the public bravado. But informal contact and an actual signed agreement remain two very different things. And right now, there's a wide, uncrossed gap between them that neither a bombing threat nor a poker analogy is going to close on its own. What do you think happens next? Does Iran finally cave and accept terms it's spent months rejecting? Or does this turn into an even longer war of attrition that just keeps grinding both sides down further? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to hear your take on where this actually goes from here. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand what's happening behind the daily headlines, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already so you catch the next update the moment something breaks, and share this with anyone in your circle who's been trying to make sense of everything going on in the Gulf right now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.